Welcome to Lecture 1, Introduction to the Study of Revelation, Entering the Symbolic World of the Apocalypse. This will happen in 3 parts. This is part 1. Entering the Symbolic World of the Apocalypse, where a book through thousands of years stirs up the hearts and awakens the soul, and leaves neither friend nor foe indifferent, and scarcely has a lukewarm friend or enemy. In such a book there must be something substantial, whatever anyone might say. Johann Gottfried von Herder, in Maranatha, 1779. Revelation is a unique book in that a person seems either to make everything of it, or else to make nothing of it. Robert G. Klaus, in 2013. Birthed in mystery and controversy. From its inception, the book of Revelation has been surrounded by mystery and controversy. It is written as a word of prophetic critique for those cozying up to Babylon, and a word of comfort to those experiencing oppression by the same seductive empire. From the beginning to present day, the apocalypse has provoked strong feelings and stronger reactions. In the early years of its reception, while the church was forging the steel of the canon, it was embraced by some and rejected by others. The voice of its prophetic authority has been proclaimed and misconstrued. It has mystified and divided believers along with several different lines of debate. Even today, there's no other biblical text that has such a wide chasm between scholarly interpretations of that book and popular readings, which use this book to determine dates and to speculate about supposed end-time events. The power of the apocalypse remains a puzzle to many, and a cause for stumbling for church folk and non-churched folk alike. A few quotes will illustrate the spectrum of visions and vitriol triggered by the book of Revelation. At the birth of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, in his preface to Revelation, included in his 1522 translation of the New Testament, expressed his consternation. "I miss more than one thing in this book of Revelation, and this makes me hold it to be neither apostolic nor prophetic. Everyone may form his own judgment of this book. As for myself, I feel an aversion to it. And to me, this is sufficient reason for rejecting it. There's one sufficient reason for me not to think highly of it. Christ is not taught or known in it. I stick to the books which give me Christ clearly and purely." It was not just those with a theological mind who have found the visions of John the Seer hard to swallow. While fundamentalist believers in North America were utilizing the apocalypse to map the immediate prophetic future at the beginning of the 20th century, philosophers and poets were taking issue with the book's enigmatic symbols and violent images. Philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead expressed ambivalence when he stated that the apocalypse is both one of the finest examples of imaginative literature, but also illustrates the barbaric elements which have been retained to the undoing of Christian intuition. The poet and literary critic D.H. Lawrence dismissed Revelation in these terms: "The apocalypse of John is, as it stands, the work of a second-rate mind. It appeals intensely to second-rate minds in every country and every century." Ad hominem attacks on the character of the author come from famed playwright George Bernard Shaw. He hurled accusations against the apocalypse such that it was of the character of a curious record of the visions of a drug addict, which was absurdly admitted to the canon under the title of Revelation. Attacks on the moral vision of the book come from none other than Friedrich Nietzsche, who charged that the apocalypse of John was the most rabid outburst of vindictiveness in all of recorded history. Harry Meyer, in an attempt to wrest the relevance of the apocalypse away from popular misuse, opens his survey of reception with the following words: "Wherever the book of Revelation shows up, trouble is not far behind. It is a menace to public safety, the Christian Crusades, Savonarola's reform of the Florentine Republic, radical Reformation movements to establish earthly theocracies of the Spirit, the discovery and colonization of the New World, the violent Christianization of the First Nations peoples, These troubling episodes name only some better-known flashpoints ignited by the apocalypse's arrival. All of these negative assessments of Revelation are countered by the theopolitical perspective of Richard Hayes in his The Moral Vision of the New Testament. Revelation must reimagine the world, and so it does. The book's imaginative power annihilates the plausibility structure on which the status quo rests and replaces it with the vision of a new world. No one can enter imaginatively into the world narrated by this book and remain complacent about things as they are in an unjust world. This means that Revelation can be read rightly only by those who are actively struggling against injustice. If Revelation is a resistance document, its significance will become clear only by those who are engaged in resistance. So, which is it? Is the book of Revelation guilty of inciting violence? Or is it the sharpest tool in the cachet of those resisting injustice? Does Revelation provoke its readers to violence? Or does it inspire an ethos for the common good? Does the apocalypse truly reveal the gospel? Or does it obscure the hope for salvation that's found in Christ? Can we expect to tremble in the wake of terror and vindictive divine judgment? Or should we anticipate spiritual ecstasy in the face of majesty who reigns from the heavenly throne? We all come to the book of Revelation with preconceived notions of what the text says and the purpose of its visions. Even if we approach this last book of the Christian canon for the first time, we will enter into the ongoing conversation with glimpses from the prevalent culture and sublime echoes that have seeped into the popular imagination. References or quasi-references are interwoven into prime television shows like The X-Files, The Simpsons, The Walking Dead, and Hollywood blockbusters such as X-Men Apocalypse, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, Armageddon, etc. The very terms apocalypse and apocalyptic have become household words associated with political, economic, and social visions, good and bad, mostly cataclysmically bad. Themes and images from Revelation pepper literature across diverse genres, from horror to sci-fi to dystopian adventure. In fact, it is the result of the fictional Left Behind novels that versions of Revelation have reached audiences of millions around the globe. Being that we all come to Revelation with presuppositions, we should be aware that there are alternatives. If we read the book with certain aims and expectations, it could be otherwise. There are pious, genuine Christian believers who read the book differently than do we. There is no one Christian way to read the book of Revelation. There are legitimately different approaches and perspectives on this challenging book. There are many uses to which the book has been employed, and there are multiple intersections with various doctrines with which the apocalypse overlaps. For example, differences regarding the meaning of the millennial reign in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 6 go back to our earliest attested readings. Debates continue to rage about whether the mention of the 1,000-year period is literal, figurative, spiritual, chronological, sequential, and or historical. Whole subsets of Christian doctrine are determined by one's decision or decisions to this particular question. Traditions of reading Revelation. It has become customary in many circles to distinguish 3 or 4 main approaches to reading Revelation. In his highly acclaimed critical commentary on Revelation in the New International Greek Testament Commentary series, Greg K. Beale identifies the 4 traditions as following. 1. The preterist view. 2. The futurist view. 3. The historicist view. And 4. The idealist view. Steve Gregg has prepared a column-by-column commentary comparing these 4 views for the entire text of Revelation. The 4 traditions in more detail are as follows. The preterist tradition. This position views the book of Revelation as referring primarily to events in the past, in the time of the author, John the Seer. It recognizes the text as predictive prophecy, but perceives that most of the events prophesied were fulfilled in the time of the original audience in the first century. The visions describe events that happened among the churches of Asia Minor and their time in relation to the Roman Empire, either mainly of Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68, or of Domitian, who reigned 81 to 96. A key event for this reading is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70 as a conclusion to the devastating Judean wars of 66 to 70 of the Common Era. This is viewed as the primary event of judgment for God's rebellious enemies and salvation for God's faithful people. One of the key figures representing this reading is Kenneth Gentry, who marshals an impressive amount of evidence and coherency in arguing for an early date of composition, that is, during the latter reign of Emperor Nero, which he believes has direct implications for the meaning of the text. A full-scale commentary in this tradition is David Chilton's extensive The Days of Vengeance. The Futurist Tradition. This position views the book of Revelation as referring primarily to events in the still coming future. Again, this approach recognizes the text as predictive prophecy, but it perceives that the events predictive have not yet been fulfilled. Indeed, they may be fulfilled very soon, even at any moment, but especially from Revelation chapter 4 onwards, the visions have yet to happen. The visions describe the chaotic events that will occur at the end of time, often called the Great Tribulation, which will immediately be followed by the return of Christ, a 1,000-year literal reign of Christ on earth, the last judgment, and the eternal state. Sometimes this view includes a hope for the rapture of the church, which will avoid the time of the tribulation and the coming of the Antichrist. There is admittedly a wide range of interpretive variation within this tradition. Undoubtedly, most contemporary popular readings of Revelation fit into this tradition. One prominent commentator here in the dispensationalist tradition would be Robert L. Thomas, who has published a 2-volume commentary on Revelation in the Wycliffe Exegetical Commentary series published by Moody, and which has in turn been influential on the well-known pastor and radio preacher John F. MacArthur. However, there are other representatives of the futurist approach that are not dispensationalist. For example, the major commentary by Grant Osborne in the Baker Exegetical Commentary series would fit into this category, as would the work of George Eldon Ladd. These latter scholars fit into what may be called the historic premillennialist tradition. Whether one approaches the book of Revelation as a simple roadmap to the future, or a broad visionary forecast of key prophetic events, the futurist approach correlates the images, symbols, and signs with real-world occurrences on the coming horizons of history. Originally, and ironically, the first hints of futurism, as well as of preterism, as a coherent strategy for reading the whole text of Revelation comes from the Spanish Jesuits who were reacting against the Protestant historicist tradition, see below, which utilized the text of Revelation to attack the Roman Catholic ecclesial authority and identify the Pope with the Antichrist. The historicist tradition. This position views the book of Revelation, often allegorically, as referring to a pre-narration of church history from apostolic times until the second coming and last judgment. Revelation portrays an ongoing process of fulfillment linked to key events in church history, and often only in Western or European church history. The breaking of the 7 seals in Revelation chapter 6 through 7, for instance, could refer to the fall of the Roman Empire in 410 of Common Era, or locusts from the bottomless pit in Revelation 9 stand for Islamic invaders, or maybe barbarian invaders, or Persians, or Christian heretics, or the beast of Revelation chapter 13 represents the papacy, according to some Protestants, etc. Often this view is linked to a postmillennial or amillennial reading of the 1,000-year reign in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. The largely influential reading of the medieval scholar Joachim of Fiore is now often categorized as historicist, not only because of the manner in which he framed his reading of Revelation in light of historical expectations, but also because of how influential his schema became in the philosophy of history. Wainwright avers that it was Joachim who made it fashionable to treat the apocalypse as a detailed account of the course of history. Later, the historicist approach became a weapon wielded by the sharp rhetoric of Martin Luther in his attack on the papacy, as well as in the counterattack back from Rome. This historicist approach became the dominant way of reading the book of Revelation during the time of the Protestant Reformation up to the modern era. In one sense, this tradition is a variation on the futurist tradition, having correlated images in Revelation with predicted events up to the time of the author's own horizons, in whatever period he lived and just beyond. Now that these times have passed, the various historicist readings have become a relic of reception history, and also show why this general appeal to distinguish these four traditions is artificial at best. That is, if the current futurist readings, especially those which try to specifically correlate the images of Revelation with particular current events, also pass without verifiable or recognizable fulfillment, then they will simply become a curiosity of the history of reception of this text, and so they will be cataloged as historicist, if they are not merely disregarded as failed prophecies. The idealist tradition. This position views the book of Revelation dramatically and figuratively as referring to a continuous struggle between good and evil, the church and the world, and the eventual triumph, the victory, of the kingdom of God. This reading challenges a one-to-one correspondence between the signs and symbols of the book's visions, and looks more to how the book can shape Christians in their struggles with sin and evil in every age that they read the book. It affirms the spiritual lessons and/or principles that are symbolically portrayed in the visions of Revelation, and which may find recurrent expression throughout history. This position also, most often, is associated with an amillennial reading of the 1,000-year reign in Revelation 20, which perceives the whole of Christian tradition history as representing this rule of the saints with the exalted Christ. This approach is associated with such distinguished figures as Augustine of Hippo, and by some, the critical commentary by Greg Beale in the New International Greek Testament Commentary series. The idealist reading also has considerable variation in interpretive strategies and approaches, as well as conclusions about the text's meanings. The idealist position, if it is understood as allowing for the polyvalence of the symbols in the text, is often extended into fuller literary or theologically oriented explorations of the apocalypse. It is important to recognize a few things about these four traditions of interpretation. First, no one of these positions is the Christian position, while the others are only positions of heretics, false teachers, or godless liberals. In fact, pious, genuine believers have held to tenets of each of these positions at different times throughout church history. Second, it's important to realize that these four traditions of reading the book of Revelation are not all mutually exclusive. In fact, each of these positions usually draws from the strengths of one or more of the others to interpret certain aspects of Revelation. For instance, just because one focuses on the future aspects of Revelation, this does not mean that she must discount the historically conditioned aspects of the book's means of communicating its message. Or, just because a person holds primarily to a preterist position, does not mean that he thinks that the New Jerusalem has fully arrived from heaven to earth, or that Jesus has arrived in final victory. Third, it is also helpful to register a fifth position, what we might call the historical literary reading of Revelation that draws from what it sees as the strengths of the four major traditions mentioned above, but also takes account of the wider body of apocalyptic literature and how this communicated a divine message to its implied audiences. As we take our survey of the book of Revelation, we will focus mainly on the literary features of the text in a historically plausible context and allow you to make up your own mind, along with your local community of faith, about how this text ought to best be read in the contemporary church in relation to broader Christian doctrines and eschatological formulations. Introduction to a critical study of the Apocalypse. The Apocalypse is, in its most basic sense, a retelling of this story of Jesus in a new way and with new images. What kind of book is the Book of Revelation? How should we approach its visions, images, sounds, symbols, and claims about God in the world? What does it mean to just read it literally? The first thing to note is that this is the Book of Revelation, not the Book of Revelations. The next time someone asks you what you think about the Book of Revelations, you can assure them that there's no such book in the Bible. This matters. This matters because this is not the book about all the crazy, terrifying, cataclysmic end-time events, including city-burning volcanoes, catastrophic earthquakes, disease, pandemic, calamities, or asteroids barreling to the earth to devastate civilizations. This book is all about Jesus the Messiah, who is the hero of a drama celebrating the coming of God's kingdom to the inhabitants of God's creation. If we miss this fact, then we have missed everything that there is that is important about the book of Revelation. It is not a book primarily about end-time scenarios. It is not about disasters that are imminent upon those who fail to accept Jesus into their hearts. It is not about the Antichrist, a term that, by the way, never shows up throughout the entire book. This is not a book about fear or terror or mysterious darkness on the imminent horizon of history. For too long, the church has ignored this rich treasure of our scriptures in teaching and preaching. Much of this neglect stems from a misunderstanding and poorly informed interpretations that fold the reading of Revelation into prophecy seminars and bizarre doomsday predictions aimed at scaring the people out of hell and terrorizing them into heaven. Too often, there has been a counterproductive irony in the way that the church has approached the book of Revelation. I grew up in a tradition that treated the book as if it were an edition of the daily newspaper for the 21st century, but transcribed in the murky understanding of a first century mystic. The prophetic character of Revelation was reduced to the features of a crystal ball, where John was allowed to see about 2 millennia into the future and did his best to describe images and events in a post-industrial nuclear age from his primitive agrarian perspective. In this way, the book of Revelation was treated more like the book of concealment, hidden from the understanding of folks who had not experienced the reality of Apache helicopters, motorized tanks, and modern weapons of mass destruction. However, this is not a book of concealment, encoding a cryptic message that would need the United Nations to reestablish the nation-state of Israel in 1948 and a rebuilt Third Temple in Jerusalem for the text to make sense. This is not a closed text, but rather an open text. See Revelation 22, verses 10 to 11. An open text whose meaning would have been readily clear to its original hearers. The Apocalypse tells a story. It is a story about Jesus. As such, the book is like a gospel. But in this case, the book dramatizes the events on a cosmic stage, both exposing and unveiling the world as it really is, and reimagining the way the world is supposed to be. To continue with the insights from David Barr, a scholar who has done much to illuminate quite a bit with regard to the literary aspects of the book, and whose quote opened this section, the recognition that the narrative of Revelation is about Jesus and not about the future or about the United States and Russia or about Middle East peace or other puzzles to solve is for me the crucial insight for understanding this work. This literary dramatic perspective will guide us throughout our study and, as we shall come to see, will contribute to recovering the text in the life of worship of God's people. Along with the elucidation that comes with insights from a literary approach to the text of the Apocalypse, we will seek to contextualize our interpretation with information from historical study. Henry Sweet helps us gain perspective as to why historical study is non-negotiable for reading Revelation. The book of Revelation starts with a well-defined historical situation to which reference is made again at the end, and the intermediate visions which form the body of the work cannot, on any reasonable theory, be dissociated from their historical setting. The prophecy arises out of local and contemporary, that is, first century of Common Era circumstances. It is, in the first instance at least, the answer of the Spirit to the fears and perils of the Asian Christians toward the end of the first century. Hence, all that can throw light on the Asia of AD 70 to 100 and upon Christian life in Asia during that period is of primary importance to the student of the Apocalypse, not only in view of the local allusions in chapters 2 and 3, but as helping to determine the aim and drift of the entire work. If we do not approach the Apocalypse with historically chastened insights, what is our alternative? If we read the vision as an allegory of church history, how do we decide if we have read it correctly? How do we avoid the trap of speculative correlation between the symbols and images of Revelation and aspects of Western Christian history? The same questions apply equally, or perhaps more forcefully, for those who read with a futurist approach and attempt to simply correlate aspects of Revelation with contemporary socio-political realities. If the daily newspaper becomes the primary lens whereby we attempt to decode the images of the Apocalypse, then we have certainly lost our way. That is, if we do not allow our reading to be held accountable by modes of understanding that were available to John and his original audience, then we risk chasing a fantasy and turning the interpretation of Revelation into another embarrassing spectacle of soon-to-be discounted failed predictions. This is not a claim that rejects the futurist or even predictive approach to Revelation outright. What it does do is preserve the integrity of Revelation as a truly communicative text, meaningful to its implied audience, the churches of Asia Minor in the first century, and therefore able to be understood by us in the 21st century. However, this will require that we attune our eyes and ears to conventions of communication that were understandable to Christians in Asia Minor in the first century, and specifically those conventions that were expressed in apocalyptic discourse and literature. As we approach our study of the book of Revelation, there are some preliminary elements that we will need to consider. We will cover most of them only briefly, as the information is readily available in most modern commentaries and study Bible notes on the text. However, it is worthwhile to draw quick attention to these issues in order to get an overview on the various critical matters related to interpreting the text. Much of this prolegomena will help us survey the landscape of the text and help us to prepare for the commentary and reflections included in the lectures. This survey includes standard aspects of study such as author, date, setting, literary structure, topics of interest for the theologically oriented audience, appropriation of Israel's scriptures, a summary of theological issues, and so on, as well as a few notes on more recent observations and interpretive methods, that is, genre considerations and rhetorical aspects. Canonical status. It will be surprising to some that the book of Revelation has a spotty history of canonical reception. There was not universal acceptance of Revelation in the early church. In fact, there's a distinct difference between the West and the East with regard to the reception of the authority of the text. In the West, it seems to have stabilized early on, after Irenaeus of Lyon attested to the authority of the text by linking it to the authorship of the Apostle John. In the East, controversy arose about authorship, and the Apocalypse became associated with those who were condemned as heretical. A leader in the Alexandrian school, Dionysius, rejected apostolic authorship and indicated a different John as author. See below when we look at authorship. Those that excluded or neglected Revelation from their teaching and preaching included Cyril of Jerusalem, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuesta, and others. The text of Revelation was excluded from the Syriac Peshitta and remains to be excluded by so-called Nestorian churches today. It was included in the list of 27 known writings of the New Testament from Athanasius in his 39th Festal Letter of 367 of the Common Era. As we noted above, Martin Luther attested to a conflicted relationship with the book. It is included in the common canons of Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, and Protestant churches. The text of Revelation. The Apocalypse of John has as many mysteries as words. St. Jerome. First, let us register the evidence for the text of the Apocalypse. Of course, we are all aware that Revelation was originally written, composed in Koine or Common Greek in the 1st century of the Common Era. The oldest extant complete copy of Revelation is found in Codex Sinaiticus, which is dated to early or mid-4th century. There are currently 4 papyrus fragments that can be dated with some probability earlier than the year 300 of the Common Era. These are Papyrus 18, 47, 98, and 115. The earliest extant fragment is P98, dated to the 2nd century. One of the most important papyrus fragments is P47, which preserves a large section from Revelation chapter 9, verse 10 through 17:2. And there is the famous textual variant of Revelation 13:18 in Papyrus 115, which has the number of the beast as 616 rather than 666, displaying the text that Irenaeus had complained about in the late 2nd century. The textual history of Revelation is complicated by several factors. The acceptance of the text as authoritative and canonical was not uniform in the early church. Furthermore, Revelation is absent in the early Greek lectionaries and thus not read in the worship services of the Greek-speaking church. This indicates that its status remained questionable and is not transmitted in these valuable witnesses. As far as patristic commentaries, there are only scattered references to the Apocalypse in Irenaeus and Tertullian. The main commentary witnesses come from the 7th to 10th centuries, from Andreas or Aretas or Ecumenius. Any attempt to study Revelation in an English translation ought to pay close attention to the marginal notes indicating variant readings, and should follow up with the sage observations of a critical commentary. Authorship. Absolute certainty eludes the student of the Apocalypse not only regarding the original text, but also with regard to the full identity of the author. On the one hand, the answer to this question is straightforward. The author explicitly identifies himself as John, see Revelation 1:4 and 9 and 22:8. He describes himself as a slave of God, 1:1, and a brother to his fellow Christian believers in 1:9. However, the information coming from the text regarding his identity stops there. Unlike the established traditions that this John is one of the sons of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 12 apostles, the author of the Revelation does not explicitly claim such a status or indicate this identity. While this may be a point of support for the traditional ascription, that is, he may have been so well known to his audience that he did not need to indicate these specifics, the fact remains that the text does not establish authority or credentials along these lines. One aspect that complicates the matter is the genre designation of this work as an apocalypse. We'll discuss this below when we talk about Revelation as an apocalypse. Often, a recognizable feature of an apocalyptic work is that it is pseudonymous. That is, it is ascribed to an author of famous repute, but who certainly did not write the work. Such figures include dignitaries like Enoch and Moses, Baruch, or Ezra. Therefore, the name John may be a feature of the rhetorical fiction of authoritative attribution to a well-known figure. However, the lack of attending titles such as apostle make this suggestion less likely. The apostles do figure as a key feature of the text of Revelation. Their names are inscribed in the 12 foundation stones of the wall around the New Jerusalem. Nowhere in the text is the prophetic status associated with the apostolic authority. If a pseudepigraphical author wanted to conscript the name and status of John the Apostle, then certainly there would have been greater effort to clarify this particular identity. Justin Martyr is the first extant writer to attribute the authorship of the Apocalypse to John the Apostle. He lived for a short while in Ephesus before coming to Rome, which has given him more credence about the traditions of the Christian community there in Ephesus in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. Justin writes, "And further, there was a certain man with us whose name was John, one of the apostles of Christ, who prophesied by a revelation that was made to him that those who believed in our Christ would dwell 1,000 years in Jerusalem, and that thereafter the general and, in short, the eternal resurrection and judgment of all men would likewise take place." Another part of what may complicate the discussion here is that there may have been several famous Johns in the first century living in the vicinity of the intended audience. As Adela Yarbrough Collins attests, the name John, Greek Ioannes, Hebrew Yohanan, was common among Jews from the exile onward and among the early Christians. According to tradition, among the churches of Asia Minor, besides the Apostle John, there was also someone designated as John the Elder. In a famous passage, Eusebius of Caesarea, his dates are around 260 to 340, the famous church historian of the 4th century quotes from Papias, his dates are from 1st century to early 2nd century, who was bishop of Hierapolis, a town which is close to Laodicea, in the early part of the 2nd century. Eusebius places Papias in the lineage of teaching of apostolic tradition, and then comments about the implications for the identity of those names John. But, Eusebius writes, Papias himself, in the preface to his discourses, by no means asserted that he was a hearer and an eyewitness of the holy apostles, but informed us that he received the doctrines of faith from their intimate friends, which he stated in the following words, and now Eusebius is quoting Papias. "But if I met with anyone who had been a follower of the elders anywhere, I made it a point to inquire what were the declarations of the elders, what was said by Andrew, Peter, or Philip, what by Thomas, James, John, Matthew, or any other of the disciples of our Lord, what was said by Aristian and the presbyter or elder John, disciples of the Lord. For I do not think that I derive so much benefit from books as from the living voice of those that are still surviving." And then Eusebius goes on to comment here. "It is proper to observe that the name of John was twice mentioned, the former of which he mentioned with Peter, James, Matthew, and the other apostles, evidently meaning the evangelist. But in a separate point of his discourse, he ranked the other John with the rest not included in the number of apostles, placing Aristian before him. He distinguished him plainly by the name of presbyter or elder. So it was here proved that the statement of those was true who asserted that there were two of the same name in Asia, and that there were also two tombs in Ephesus, and that both are called John's even to this day, which it is particularly necessary to observe, for it is probable that the second, if it be not allowed that it was the first, saw the revelation ascribed to John." As we look at the words of Papias here, transmitted by Eusebius, we see possibilities beyond what Eusebius constricts. In the quote from Papias, there are two mentions of John. In the first place, the name is set alongside names familiar from the list of Jesus' 12 disciples. And we can cross-reference with Mark 3, verses 14 through 19, Matthew 10, verses 1 through 4, and Luke 6, verses 12 through 16. Then there is the naming of the elder John, who is listed with Aristian, a name clearly not known among the 12 apostles. So there are a few options to consider here. First, one obvious conclusion is that there were two different Johns mentioned here, John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle, and a different John, perhaps called the elder. Another option is that the two mentions of the name John do in fact refer to the same person, because as we can see in the immediate preceding material, the apostles can be referred to with the title elders. In this case, John is mentioned twice because he's the only one of the living apostles still living. Contemporaneously with Aristian, at the time of Papias' writing. Drawing from writings from a bishop of Alexandria named Dionysius, Eusebius draws further conclusions about the authorship and character of the Apocalypse. It's worth quoting the passage often cited in commentaries by Eusebius, who himself is citing Dionysius, at length. After this, he proceeded further to speak of the revelation of John as follows, and now he begins to quote Dionysius. Some indeed before us have set aside and have attempted to refute the whole book, criticizing every chapter and pronouncing it without sense and without reason. They say it has a false title, for it is not of John. Nay, it is not even a revelation, as it is covered with a dense and thick veil of ignorance, and not one of the apostles and not one of the holy men or those of the church could be its author. But that Corinthus, the founder of the sect of the Corinthians, so called from him, wished to have reputable authority for his own fiction prefixed to the title, for this is the doctrine of the Corinthians, that there will be an earthly reign of Christ, and that he was a lover of the body, and altogether sensual in those things which he so eagerly craved. He dreamed that he would revel in the gratification of the sensual appetite. For my part, Dionysius says here, I would not venture to set this book aside, as there are many brethren that value it much. But having formed a conception of its subject as exceeding my capacity, I consider it containing a certain concealed and wonderful intimation in each particular. For, though I do not understand, yet I suspect that some deeper sense is enveloped in the words, and these I do not measure and judge by my private reason. But allowing more to faith, I regarded them as too lofty to be comprehended by me, and those things which I do not understand, I do not reject, but I wonder the more that I cannot comprehend. Now that's the end of the quote from Dionysius. Eusebius picks up making comments here. After this, he examined the whole book of the Revelation, and after proving it impossible that it should be understood according to the obvious and literal sense, he proceeded, again now quoting Dionysius, the prophet having completed the whole prophecy, he pronounces those blessed that should observe it as himself. For blessed, he says, is he that keepeth the words of the prophecy of this book, and I, John, who have seen and heard these things. I do not therefore deny that he was called John, and that this was the writing of one John, and I agree that it was the work also of some holy and inspired men. But I would not easily agree that this was the apostle, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, who is the author of the gospel and the general epistle that bears his name. But I conjecture, both from the general tenor of both, and the form and complexion of the composition, and the execution of the whole book, that it is not from him. For the evangelist never prefixes his name, never proclaims himself either in the gospel or in his epistle. And now Eusebius continues on. Eusebius says a little farther, he, Dionysius, added, John never speaks of himself in the first person, nor of another in the third, but he that wrote the Apocalypse declares himself immediately in the beginning, in Revelation 1 through 2, identifying himself as John. Besides this, he wrote an epistle. John to the 7 churches of Asia, grace and peace to you. But the evangelist does not prefix his name to his general epistle. That it is a John that wrote these things, we must believe him, as he says it. But what John it is uncertain. For he has not said that he was, as he often does in the gospel, the beloved disciple of the Lord, neither the one leaning on his bosom, not the brother of James, nor that he himself saw and heard what the Lord said and did. For he certainly would have said one of these particulars if he wished to make himself clearly known. But all of this, there is nothing. He only calls himself our brother and companion and the witness of Jesus, and blessed on account of seeing and hearing these revelations. I am of the opinion that there were many of the same name with John the Apostle who, for their love and admiration and emulation of him, and their desire at the same time, like him, to be beloved of the Lord, adopted the same epithet, just as we find the name of Paul or Peter to be adopted by many among the faithful. Then what follows is an exploration of the possibility that the author is John Mark, maybe, a thesis which Dionysius ultimately rejects. And then he offers a comparison of the style of the gospel and the first epistle of John, so we'll jump ahead in the text and pick up reading. And altogether throughout, to the attentive observer, it will be obvious that there is one and the same complexion and character in the gospel and epistle. Very different and remote from all of this is the apocalypse, not even touching or bordering upon them in the least, I might say. We make also notice how the phraseology of the gospel in the epistle differs from the apocalypse. For the former are written not only reprehensibly as it regards the Greek language, but are most elegant in diction, in the arguments, and the whole structure of the style. It would require much to discover any barbarism or solecism or any odd peculiarity of expression at all in them. For as is to be presumed, he was endued with all the requisites for his discourse, the Lord having granted him both that of knowledge and that of expression and style. That the latter, however, saw revelation and received knowledge and prophecy, I do not deny, but I perceive that his dialect and language is not very accurate Greek, that he uses barbarous idioms and in some places solecisms, which it is now unnecessary to select, for neither would I have anyone suppose that I'm saying these things by way of derision, but only with a view to point out the great difference between the writings of these men. Date of composition. The symbolic universe of every text is shaped by its historical context and cultural milieu. The logic, the sense of a text, is discovered only when it is read in terms of a specific culture, specific historical circumstances, and a particular point of view. If this point of view is not a reconstruction of the original context of the text, it will inevitably be the cultural perspective of the interpreter, perhaps shaped by some powerful interpretation between the author's and the interpreter's time. Adela Yarbrough Collins in Crisis of Catharsis. Different contexts provide different possibilities for different meanings of texts. It is for this reason, among others, that it is important to query the date of composition of the book of Revelation. While different dates could align with differing occasions for writing, the main options do not radically change the interpretation of the text. Our approach is in agreement with Beale. One can in fact affirm the early date or late date without the main interpretive approach being affected. Even if we do not completely share the historical critical optimism of Yarbrough Collins in the statement above for the possibility of a complete reconstruction of the historical circumstances of the apocalypse, or any text for that matter, we can agree that our interpretive judgments must be informed and chastened by socio-historically contextual data. If this is not the case, then John's visions becomes the subject of the spinning of a semiotic will, where they could be made out to say anything at all, and even be exploited by the rhetorical terrorism of doomsday quacks and the arbitrary timelines of so many contemporary so-called prophecy buffs. If one is fully persuaded by Hal Lindsey and company, who portray the book of Revelation as a crystal ball or a divine time machine, and a cryptically deciphered version of tomorrow's newspaper, then he or she ought to avoid all contemporary academic scholarship on Revelation. However, if these discredited approaches have left you dissatisfied and longing for a more coherent and plausible reading of Revelation, then we must be patient with the historical questions. There are two basic possibilities, with variations, for the date of the composition of Revelation. These are commonly referred to as the early date, referring to the authorship in the late 60s, just after the reign of the Emperor Nero, and the later date, referring to authorship in the mid to late 90s of the Common Era under the Emperor Domitian. As with the issue of authorship, certainty eludes scholarship, both ancient and modern. Both internal and external factors are considered to identify the most plausible date of composition. The internal factors are those that have a range of possible understandings. There is little within the messages to the seven churches in Revelation 2 through 3 that allows for precise dating. For example, crucial to both datings is the connection between Emperor Nero, or legends about Nero, and the beast from the sea of Revelation 13, especially 13 verse 3, which is most often read as referring to the supposed or rumored death and return of Nero. Also, the reference to the 7 kings and their identification with the 7 heads of the beast in Revelation 17 have often been correlated with socio-political realities of the Roman Empire in the first century of the Common Era. The identification of the evil city Babylon in Revelation 14:8, 16:19, 17:5, 18:2, and verses 10 and 21, which with the city of Rome is another common interpretational move, whether it be the ancient city, contemporary John the Seer, or some renovation associated with a second coming of Rome's occurrence. Another factor, variously interpreted, is the presence of the temple that is supposed to be measured by John in Revelation 11, verses 1 through 3. These internal factors have pointed in different directions. For instance, reference to the measuring of the temple in Revelation 11 has been deemed as evidence for a pre-70 date because the Jerusalem temple is supposed to still be standing. The interpretation here correlates the image of the measured temple with the empirical temple in Jerusalem. On the other hand, the correlation with Nero, or a legend of Nero, with the beast of Revelation 13 and the identification of the 7 heads of the beast in Revelation 17 with 7 kings has been used as interpretive evidence that the composition of the book must have taken place during the reign of Domitian. The legends about Nero, it is supposed, would need to have time to develop and become well known. The reference to the 7 kings with their specific presentation, as it reads, 7 kings of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living, and another has not yet come, in Revelation 17, 9 and 10, has seemed to many interpreters to indicate a listing of Roman emperors. However, this is complicated by several factors. First, it's not clear whether the list should begin with Julius Caesar, Octavian Augustus, or some other emperor, thus implicating the identity of this 6th king who currently is. Second, the rapid succession of 3 rulers in between the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the Flavian dynasty in the year 69 has frustrated attempts to outline a simple sequence. Furthermore, when the name of the city Babylon, Revelation 14, 19, 17, 18, is read as referring to the city of Rome in John's day, this suggests to many modern commentators that this must be a post-70 reference. Few have suggested that John is referring to the ancient city of Babylon, long destroyed by the time John could have received his visions. However, besides the New Testament writing, alongside Revelation, see 1 Peter 5:13, Jewish writings that refer to Rome as Babylon come from the period after the Romans had destroyed the Jerusalem temple. That is why 70 of the Common Era is the pivotal date. Yarbrough Collins notes that this use of the eponym in 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch and the 5th book of the Sibylline Oracles. She notes that before the catastrophic conflict of 66 to 70, other monikers were attached to Rome, such as Egypt, Kittim, and Edom, the last of which is the most common in rabbinic literature. One other alternative, often preferred by preterists, is the identification of Babylon with the city of Jerusalem. While this designation may facilitate for some a closer parallel between the judgment of Babylon in Revelation 18 and the celebration of New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 to 22, it's not in the past nor present scholarship found much support. As Beale notes, the use of Babylon may be one of the strongest pieces of internal evidence that the book is dated after 70 AD, since after that date the name is typically applied to Judaism, in Judaism to Rome. On the other hand, there's not one example of Babylon ever being a symbolic name for Israel, either before or after 70 AD. The external evidence is also mixed in supporting either the early or the late date. Irenaeus, writing about the year 180 of the Common Era, expresses the view that John's visions happened at the end of the reign of Domitian, around 95 or 96. In a passage considering the mystery and meaning of the number of the beast in Revelation 13:18, Irenaeus cautions against speculating about the identity of the beast, whom he refers to here as the Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen not very long, no very long time since, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign. While modern scholarship agrees with the general tenor of Irenaeus' claim here, it does not do so for the same reasons. Even Eusebius, as we have seen, was not persuaded by Irenaeus' belief that the author John was the same author of the Gospel and the Apocalypse. Perhaps the best posture is to follow Craig Kester, who suggests the general period of 80 to 100. This range of dates will help to identify common social patterns to help contextualize the imagery and rhetorical patterns of the text. Again, David de Silva expresses a cautious but persuasive view. He says, on balance, though I would be reluctant to accept a Domitianic date primarily on the basis of Irenaeus' late 2nd century testimony, the prominence of the imperial cult in Revelation, particularly as a response to the complete closure of the wound that threatened the beast, matches well the increased excitement surrounding this cult in the Flavian period, which the dates are 69 to 96. Other factors, such as the appearance of the churches in cities of which no mention is made in Christian writings from the period before 70 CE, the increasing focus on participation in the traditional and imperial cult as the point of conflict between the church and society, and the echoes of the economic crisis that an edict of Domitian sought to help correct, all point to a setting during the late Flavian period. Further aspects of corroborating evidence, such as the phenomenon of the imperial cult and or a supposed scenario of persecution, will be considered in the section below, where we see setting and situation. Genres, the kind of writing of Revelation. Along with the general socio-historical context, identifying the genre, that is, the kind of writing, of the text will assist immensely in identifying the proper interpretation of the text. Attending to the genre of a text is like playing a game according to its rules. Imagine this. You're in a class that decides to go to the gym and play a game to blow off some steam. You all dress in some loose-fitting shorts with a matching top that is sleeveless for ease of movement. You play in a large room in a gym surrounded by bleachers. The floor is covered in nicely polished wood planks, and the area to play is marked by a large rectangle with a circle in the middle to indicate sides. You all will play with a large orange ball, very bouncy with some black lines running around the circumference of the ball. It's easy to grip. Now, on either side of the playing area, there are raised white platforms turned on their side with a large circular ring protruding from the vertical platforms. The disc has a white net hanging from it. In order to play, you're all going to start out in the middle of the circle. The ball will be thrown in the air for either team to grab, depending on who's able to jump high enough. Then, your teammates will tuck the ball under their arm and charge the opposing team's net-marked ring. You will push and grab the opposing team members in order to assist your own team members to get to the area where they are close to the goal. Then, once your team members arrive, they'll form a pyramid underneath the netted ring, and the one holding the ball will climb upon their backs to drop the ball through the ring, and that will count as a point. What game have I just described? It certainly sounded like I began describing basketball. The teams wore basketball jerseys. They were playing on a basketball court with a basketball. However, they clearly weren't following the rules of the game basketball. Thus, they were not playing basketball. You can't play a game if you do not play by the rules. It's the same with texts. If you're not reading a text, if you are not attending to the generic rules that govern its composition and communicational strategy. Certainly there is freedom for creativity within certain limits, and there is a fluidity to what is referred to as genre. However, if you do not read a text according to its genre rules, then we are reading something else, and quite likely turning the text into something other than what it is inherently. The genre of the text helps to establish both the conventions for writing and receiving the text. Authors compose text in relation to other texts through imitation, transformation, or refutation. Not only does the broad category of genre help guide an author in choosing how to represent the material that she desires to communicate, but genre also has a hermeneutical function, guiding the reader in framing expectations for how to understand the text. We read a newspaper article differently than we read a poem. We interpret a user's manual differently than we understand the function of a novel. We use different expressions and stylistic features when we are writing a letter when compared to writing a research paper, or we should. Different kinds of writings entail different strategies of communication and interpretation. For most encounters with text, we naturally adjust our understandings and interpretive methods. We adjust for referential language and symbolic metaphors. We adapt our expectations regarding tone and style. We do this quite naturally in most activities of reading and interpretation. However, foreign genres provide a peculiar challenge. Revelation is a particularly challenging text in this regard because it is a mix of at least three genres, two that are basically familiar and one that is not commonly in general use today. Revelation is a mix of one, ancient epistle or letter, two, written prophetic utterance, and three, apocalyptic drama. Because of this complexity, one recent textbook on methods of interpretation refers to the book of Revelation as a prophetic apocalyptic letter. A brief word about each of these will guide our understanding of the generic conventions that govern both the composition and the reception of the book of Revelation. Revelation as epistle. Bible interpretation must be historically oriented because the Bible is oriented to the mighty acts of God in history. The original hearer-readers needed no explanation of the situation since they experienced it directly. Indeed, explaining the obvious to the original hearer-readers would have robbed the letter of its power. Later readers will have to be informed of the situation in order to understand it. If we want to understand Revelation, the first principle is to read it in terms of its original hearer-readers and their situation, Eugene Boring in his commentary on Revelation. Revelation is a letter, an ancient epistle, most closely resembling the epistles of the Apostle Paul. It begins with a formal epistolary opening with sender, receiver, greeting, and prayer wish, see Revelation 1, 4-8, and a formal epistolary closing in 22:16 through 21. As a letter, in fact, the longest letter included in the canonical collection of the New Testament, Revelation is inherently an occasional text, a situational letter. Therefore, historically speaking, reading ancient epistles is like reading other people's mail. If we were to rifle through our neighbor's mail, her personal correspondence, social invitations, greeting cards, thank you notes, etc., we would understand the basic ideas and be able to discern the fundamental grammar of the texts. However, in correspondences such as these, there are shared contexts, hidden presuppositions, unspoken inferences, common assumptions and details, etc., that would be understood by the parties involved, but they would be missed or misread by outsiders. Much of what we communicate to conversation partners happens at the level of inference and implicature, hidden below the surface of words actually used to communicate. Therefore, when dealing with an ancient text, we have a necessity of historical reconstruction and the support of evidence to reconstruct a plausible context for the words in a text. For Revelation, this includes other ancient texts, literary as well as inscriptional, as well as visual artifacts, such as statues, reliefs, monuments, and coins, etc. Recognizing that Revelation is a letter will help to anchor our reading in history. This does not, of course, relegate its meaning or function simply to the past. No informed Christian would say that Paul's letter to the Corinthians are irrelevant for believers today simply because we are not part of that ancient congregation or group of house churches living in Rome and Corinth in the first century. No informed Christian would deny the trans-temporal significance of the Gospels simply because they narrate events that happened in Roman Palestine in the first century. Likewise, the recognition that the book of Revelation is an occasional letter does not reduce it to some ancient artifact that cannot convey the Word of God to the people of God today. But it does mean that we will need to invest study into the broad context of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean world and its socio-historical context in order to understand why and how Revelation speaks from and into the world in the ways that it does. Revelation is a letter. More accurately, with Richard Bauckham, Revelation is a circular letter. And more fully, with Michael Gorman, we can say that Revelation is a circular pastoral letter. It was written to address the circumstances and situations of real space-time people living in the real historical cities of Asia Minor, located in what is now Western Turkey, to whom the 7 messages in Revelation, chapters 2 through 3, are addressed: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. It is likely that the assemblies living in these 7 cities were chosen to represent a broader audience, likely intending to include all Christian believers. But this recognition of the symbolic meaning of the number 7 should not preclude the acknowledgement that these were real people, and that the messages are shaped by specific circumstances to those living in these particular cities. We'll consider these issues in Lecture 3 when we cover those 7 messages from the risen Jesus. In fact, the order of the messages seems to be arranged according to the order of the travel one would make from the island of Patmos to Asia Minor, beginning with Ephesus, heading northward, and making one's way around to Laodicea. John writes to the believers living in these cities, and the messages to the 7 churches in Revelation 2 through 3 serve as a prelude to the visions themselves. The prologue indicates that this circular letter is supposed to be read aloud amidst the congregations. See Revelation 1:3. More about the oral character of the letter below in 1.3.9 Rhetoric and Style. More, the fact that the epistolary features frame the whole work indicates that the whole of the text is to be read as a message to the 7 churches in their time and their place. This should preclude a reading that separates the meaning and significance of the first part of Revelation in chapters 1 through 3 from what follows in chapters 4 through 22. We are in agreement with Greg Beale when he writes, "One of the main features of this epistolary pattern is that the themes of the introduction are developed throughout the body of the letter. It is clear that the introductions of the 7 letters and the introductory Son of Man vision of chapter 1 pertain to the same general time period and interpret one another, as primarily do also the conclusions of the 7 messages and the book's final vision of bliss. This points to the likelihood that the same relationships cohere between the body of the letters and the visionary body of the book. It is in this sense that we can call the letters the literary microcosm of the entire book's macrocosmic structure." Richard Bauckham also offers insightful analysis about the function of these messages to address the particular issues facing the auditors, as well as to prepare them for the ensuing visions. He writes, "Each message is specifically relevant to the situation of the church addressed, which John knew well. These 7 messages show us that the 7 churches were very different, facing problems and reacting very differently to the common problems. Christ speaks individually to each church, but the messages are not self-contained. Each is an introduction to the rest of the book. The device of the 7 messages enables John to engage appropriately with the 7 different contexts in which his book would be read, and also to integrate those contexts in the broader perspective of the rest of the book, in which John is concerned with the worldwide tyranny of Rome, and even more broadly, with the cosmic conflict of God and evil and the eschatological purpose of God for his whole creation. Each of these messages sets the scene for how that assembly will be evaluated in light of God's unveiling of world circumstances. These messages prepare the audience to understand what their challenges are, whether it be harassment and persecution or the dangers of accommodation to Babylon's exploitive economy and the lure of idolatrous devotion. The letters also prescribe what each assembly needs to do to attain victory, that is, to be overcomers in the subsequent conflict. These messages are the preface to the visions, and they set the tone for how the visions would be received among the churches, as comfort or warning, or a mix of the two. Again, Baucham's comment is illuminating about the dynamics here. In each of the very different church situations, the call is to be victorious, but the meaning of victory is unexplained. What it is to conquer becomes clear only from the rest of the book, in which the conquerors appear, and it is revealed what they conquer and in what their victory consists. Thus, the call to conquer, addressed to the Christians in each of the 7 churches in chapters 2 through 3, is a call to engage in the eschatological battle described in the central chapters of the book in order to reach the eschatological destiny described at the end of the book. In a sense, the whole book is about the way the Christians of the 7 churches may, by being victorious within specific situations of their own churches, enter the New Jerusalem. While the book as a whole explains what the war is about and how it must be won, the message to each church alerts the church to what is specific about its section of the battlefield. This definition or redefinition of what is at stake in the conflict and what counts as victory is potentially subversive in the world governed by Roman imperial theology. Under that system of ideology, victory meant destroying those who would oppose the might of Rome, vanquishing the enemy, and causing destruction wherever the boots of their armies marched. One quote from a British chieftain named Calgacus, who was vanquished by the general Agricola, relayed by the Roman historian Tacitus, will suffice to express the devastation of the Pax Romana experienced by those at the other end of the Roman sword. Calgacus says, "East and West alike have failed to satisfy them. To robbery, butchery, and rapine they give the lying name of government. They create a desolation and call it peace. Our wives and sisters, even if they are not raped by enemy soldiers, are seduced by men who are supposed to be our friends and guests. Our goods and money are consumed by taxation. Our land is stripped of its harvest to fill their granaries. Our hands and limbs are crippled by building roads through forests and swamps under the lash of our oppressors. We Britons are sold into slavery anew every day." Therefore, there is a well-established, deeply entrenched understanding of victory and triumph in the Roman world. Members of the Christian assemblies in Asia Minor are suffering, then there would have been clear options of coercion, or at least manipulation and maneuvering of a system that was inscribed in buildings and temples, roads and coins and inscriptions, which portrayed what would have seemed natural to those living in the world at that time. That is, it would have all appeared to be a natural order unless a truer vision of the world could expose the false, corrupt social order. Revelation was intended to be an oral performance so that the audience is brought up into a new symbolic world that would change the perception of the audience to see who really is the Lord who rules over the world. Christians, along with everyone else living under the established order of the Roman Empire, would have been bombarded with images of the Roman imperial power and success, victory. In this context, the images of Revelation would have been a purge of the Christian social and religious imagination. The messages to the 7 churches help to frame the proper reception of these images. As we delve into the visions in chapters 4 through 22 of Revelation, we will do well to remain anchored in the life world of the 7 churches in Asia Minor, which represent the whole church living under the pressures of Rome's insatiable and exploitive appetites. Revelation as prophecy. The question that divides traditional and modern interpreters is this: are Daniel and Revelation principally books of historical foresight or theological insight? The apocalyptic writers were deeply concerned about theology, in particular about the question of God's presence in human history. It was their insight that theological affirmations necessarily had future consequences, that a righteous and loving God ultimately must win. Craig Hill, In God's Time. The current pop eschatology misunderstanding of Revelation as a book of long-range predictions, forecasting events in our own time that is encouraged not only by the cultural misunderstandings of prophecy as prediction, but by the fact that John does announce events in the future. If Revelation were really a book of predictions of later events, such as the oil crisis of the Middle East, Russian and American militarism, it would have been meaningless to its first readers and would not have been a letter to them at all. Eugene Boring in his commentary on Revelation. Along with being the longest letter in the New Testament, Revelation presents itself as a prophetic utterance, complete with a promise for compliance and a warning against alteration. These words also frame the central visions. Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and keep what is written in it, for the time is near. Revelation 1:3. See, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. 22:7. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book. If anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away that person's share in the tree of life and in the holy city which are described in this book. 22 verses 18 through 19. So, Revelation is self-consciously written as prophecy. But what exactly does that mean? For some, the designation of prophecy clearly indicates that John was predicting future events. John may or may not actually be predicting future events, but such a simple declaration presumed from the definition of prophecy displays a limited understanding of prophecy in the Israelite biblical tradition. In biblical tradition, the designation of prophecy marks something primarily as a proclamation and only secondarily as prediction. That is, the majority of what counts as biblical prophecy comes in the form of forthtelling, and then can also include some foretelling. This creates a hurdle for modern readers, because the designation of prophecy calls to mind images of shrouded, wild-eyed diviners who are struck by visions of events that will shortly come to pass. Prophets are like psychics who see events looming in distant space and time. They are imagined to be like God-inspired fortune tellers, burdened with a calling to see imminent tragedy, but who are often ignored by skeptics and doubters. To immediately associate Revelation with such popularized misconceptions of prophecy will no doubt predispose us to mishandling the strange visions of Revelation. According to one popular textbook about understanding interpretive skills and learning to properly handle the conventions of differing genres, less than 2% of Old Testament prophecy is messianic. Less than 5% specifically describes the New Covenant age. Less than 1% concerns events yet to come in our age. Even if it is not entirely clear how these authors would define messianic or delineate the terms of the New Covenant age, we can see that there ought to be an initial caution for readers of Revelation who would simply presume that the self-designation of prophecy necessitates a reference of future events. Instead, we can clarify the designation with the colorful words of D. Brent Sandy. Prophecy was first of all oratory, because the prophets were first of all preachers. In the hearing of crowds and kings, they denounced, warned, and assured. Not only did the substance of their sermons call for vivid words, the iciness of their audience required burning rhetoric. They needed expressions that would explode in the heads and hearts of their hearers. The language is imaginative, etching graphic pictures on our minds. It is conversation, drawing us into dialogue with the prophet. It is invitation. Stop and ponder the word pictures. It is mind-jarring, hope-crushing, and heart-rending. It is above all poetic. The prophets were wordsmiths, master carpenters. Prophecy, therefore, is closer to preaching than it is to fortune-telling or psychic predictions. However, Craig Kester reminds us that prophecy is a distinctive form of divine communication, not a general term for Christian preaching. The apocalypse as prophecy is not merely a sermon, which would be more appropriate as a genre for Hebrews or 1 John. Rather, Revelation is a literary expression of early Christian prophecy, both a continuation of the vocation of the prophetic traditions of ancient Israel, as well as an extension of the living voice of the risen Jesus through early Christian prophets. This understanding of Revelation's self-designation as prophecy is crucial to correct a misunderstanding. Revelation's self-identification as prophecy is a claim not so much about the future referent of its described events as much as it is a claim about the divine origin or source of its utterances. That is, to claim that Revelation is prophecy is to claim that it comes as divine speech. It is not, therefore, primarily a simple expression of certain Christian beliefs or perspectives on the world. It is presented rather as a divine revelation about the world, those who live in the world, the right way to live in the world, and the truest claims about the whole purpose and destiny of the world. Revelation is a message from the covenant and creator God who is supremely revealed in the slaughtered yet risen Lamb who commissions John as a slave, see Revelation 1:1 and 10:11, to convey the divine message to the world. Again, Eugene Boring speaks eloquently here. The authority behind the prophet's message is not empirical observation, common sense, human experience, religious tradition, or interpretation of Scripture, as is the case with scribes, rabbis, and teachers. The prophet is one who speaks because he or she has been given his or her message directly from God. The prophet speaks on the basis of revelation. The message thus received may or may not contain predictions. It is prophecy because it comes as revelation from God. John claims to have received his visions through the power of God's Spirit, the Spirit of prophecy. See Revelation 1:10, 4:2, 17:3, 21:10. The Spirit is portrayed as speaking through his words conveyed in John's text. See Revelation 2:7 and verses 11, 17, 29. In short, John conveys a divine message. See Revelation 1:8, the whole of chapters 2 and 3, and 21, verses 5 through 8. Furthermore, it certainly speaks truly about the future of the world, of God's creation, but not clearly in the way that is so often assumed in popular futurist interpretations of the text. That is, to affirm Revelation's self-identification as prophecy is not to confirm that the text is some kind of literary crystal ball. In a recent theological monograph about prophecy, Ellen Davis marks out 5 key characteristics of what she calls the prophetic perspective in the Judeo-Christian tradition. These 5 elements are illuminating for a reflection on Revelation as Christian prophecy. 1. The concreteness of the prophetic expressions, which both engages hearers in particular contexts and makes vivid God's engagement in the world. 2. The prophetic demand for moral, economic, and religious integrity in human communities, Israel or the church, and the recognition that the human integrity in these several dimensions is fundamentally related to the God-given integrity of creation. 3. Prophetic participation in the suffering of the vulnerable within the created order and the social order, and the prophetic witnessing to the suffering of God. 4. The prophet as the trusted friend of God, trusted with the ministry of protest, prayer, healing, and reconciliation. And 5. Prophetic witness to the theological significance of those who do not worship Israel's God, which is potentially a witness of reconciliation. Recognizing that the designation of prophecy is an affirmation about the divine source of the visions and their Spirit-inspired interpretation is crucial. More can be said. There is a specific determination of the meaning of prophecy in Revelation. See Revelation 19:10, the spirit of prophecy is the witness of Jesus Christ. Prophecy is a message from God. In Revelation, one can speak more specifically that it is a message about or from Jesus. The of in the above statement is ambiguous. It can be understood in several ways. Two of the most important ways are these. The spirit of prophecy is the testimony about Jesus, or the spirit of prophecy is the testimony that comes from Jesus. It is possible that both ideas are present in the ambiguous grammatical expression. Christian prophecy, as it is conveyed through Revelation, is both, one, about giving witness to the risen Christ, his victory, and the manner in which he reveals the character of the enthroned God, and two, a conduit to convey the message that comes from the risen Jesus, who speaks most authoritatively for God. The chain of prophetic utterance represented in Revelation 1:1 will be explored when we consider that verse in the next lecture. One other observation should be made in reference to the recognition of Revelation as Christian prophecy. John was a Christian prophet speaking in a context of competition with the messages of other recognized Christian prophets. The messages to the seven churches reveal that there were other prophets who spoke messages to the believers in the assemblies which are contradicted and rebuked by the risen Lord Jesus through John. In the message to the church at Pergamum, a rival prophet is called Balaam. Confer Numbers 25 and 31. A Christian prophet designated with the moniker Jezebel, compare 1 Kings 18 through 21, plagues the church at Thyatira. See Revelation 2:20. These references were designated or designed to highlight similarities between the enemies of faithfulness in ancient days and the enemies of faithfulness in the contemporary situation. John is locked in rhetorical combat with rival prophets with whom John staunchly disagrees and whose messages pose the kind of dangers John is writing to resist. Again, we will examine the details of this conflict when we explore the messages to the seven churches in Revelation chapters 2 through 3. The lecture will be continued in part 2.